Hello and welcome to this video, and this is another video where I'm going to be talking about important jazz fusion musicians from the 1980s and the 1990s and following on, because I've been talking a lot about 70s fusion, and we've been getting into Weather Report and Return to Forever, and we all love those. But as I've said elsewhere, the 80s becomes a little bit troublesome for jazz fusion, and I've just done a video where we've really tried to discuss why I think that is. But I really wanted to put the attention on a couple of 80s musicians that I don't think get enough attention. One's Bill Laswell, another one is Steve Coleman and the whole M-bass movement. And today I want to talk a little bit about JOHN ZORN. JOHN ZORN is another massively influential musician that has changed the face of music, and yet a lot of people aren't aware of him. Does he get classed as fusion? Not really, but of course it totally is fusion. He's fusing jazz with rock and pop music and every style of genre. This is one of the things about JOHN ZORN. So JOHN ZORN emerges in the 80s, and he comes in with a completely fresh approach to fusion. I would say that the whole key to JOHN ZORN's approach is it's a fusion. Right? He's fusing music with other music, very much in his own individual way, very much like Bill Laswell did. And actually, Zorn has worked with Laswell. They crop up. I on the Laswell video, I talked about a practice album called Sacrificed, which is almost like a sort of death metal, avant-garde free jazz album. And Zorn's on there, and Zorn's a really important aspect of that album. But Zorn brings in another approach that I find absolutely fascinating. He's like a composer. A lot of his compositions, actually, he's done a lot that are rooted in the Jewish tradition that he comes from as well. So there's that aspect in there. But he's a composer. But he's interested in different ways of composing. And I think the aspects that would define him would be he's really interested in genre. And he's really interested in going in really deeply into forms outside jazz and outside rock. Right, so, and he's really interested in music forms like, for example, Carl Stalling and the soundtracks to, say, Tom and Jerry cartoons. He's influenced heavily by that sort of cartoon music. He's interested in all sorts of different film music. He's really interested by Ennio, influenced by Ennio Morricone. So he's pulling a lot of film references as well. He's also using avant-garde modern classical music approaches to composition. Right? He said his music's really would be liked by people with a short attention span because he loves to jump genre very quick, almost like it's edits in films. He said his music is like someone surfing cable TV. And so you get bursts. You'll get bursts of country and western. You'll get a burst of heavy metal. You'll get a burst of James Brown funk. He has a pool of musicians around him that are absolutely incredible, that seem to be able to do all sorts of gymnastics. The virtuosity level of some of this stuff is incredibly high because of what he's demanding from the musicians. Right? In terms of the fusion with rock music, he sees, like Laswell, I think he sees the link between free jazz, Albert Ayler, Archie Shepp, Peter Brotzmann. He sees the link between that type of screaming free jazz and thrash metal and death metal. Zorn goes much more often down the death metal route. He's also really interested in really dark imagery, real sort of the underside of American culture. He's really interested in comics and sort of stuff that is low art, not high art. Those are all the things that you get with JOHN ZORN. The starting album I'd like to show you first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do on this my 5 favourite JOHN ZORN albums. I've pulled out just 5 to keep it simple, and I'm going to show you one more at the end as a sort of extra bonus. But the first one I'd like to put up is Cobra. Now Cobra is an early album made in 1985, and it's been made using what JOHN ZORN calls one of his games. Right, now the games, this is a system that you create where he uses hand signals, cue cards, And if you look on the album here, you can see he's actually got a printout of the system that he used to create this album. There it is. And these are basically different cue cards, different symbols, where he can set up certain games. So he's got a thing called here, operations. And it says squad leader only. I assume that's Zorn. And number 1 is divisi. Memory drone, squad leader tactics and system control. And then the next one is intercut, locus unit return to the same sound. And then you got fences, unit with alternatives. So what you have is a very complex set of instructions. Any one of you that knows Frank Zappa knows that Frank Zappa had a whole bunch of symbols and different hand things that he could cue his musicians. And often he would create compositions by doing that. Well, Zorn's doing this at a very, very high level. And this album, Cobra, is entirely about that. Right? It's entirely about that way, that thing of creating those games. It's really interesting because Zorn is actually a little bit of a dictator, I think, when it comes to music. It's definitely his vision, you know, when you listen to it. But although Zorn's vision is so strong and perhaps dictatorial, I'm using his, you know, maybe not his terminology, but on here he says this is definitely my vision. But he's actually, his compositions cannot exist without the personalities in that unit. In its improvisation in a really strange fashion. So I'm sure that's pricked people's interest, you know, and that's the album to get. If you really want to see the Zorn approach in its essence, check out Cobra. Fantastic album. And you get 2 versions of the Cobra suite. One is in the studio and you get a live version, so you can compare the 2 and try and work out what the hell he's doing. The next album I want to put that up is this one, Spillane. Now what we get on Spillane is 3 separate compositions by Zorn. And I'm going to pull these out and just go through them very quickly. So the first one is a track called Spillane, and it's really taking its influence from those sort of films noir, you know, 1940s black and white films. And those films are really coming out of the sort of Dashiell Hammett and Mickey Spillane novels that inspired that sort of, you know, and if you don't know that, that's the sort of, you know, Humphrey Bogart with the sort of black and white detective and a mysterious woman walks in and gives him a case, you know, that sort of thing that was lampooned in things like, you know, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, you know. So, and Laswell's brilliant at doing this. He can sort of take that and make music from that, which is not just, oh, that would be a great film soundtrack. It's actually future music. You never heard anything like it in your life. So on here, let's have a look at it. It says, written and arranged by John Zorn in collaboration with Anthony Coleman on piano, Carol Emanuel harp, Bill Frisell, the great Bill Frisell on guitar, Dave Hofstra on bass, Bob James on tapes, Bobby Privett on drums, fantastic drummer, Jim Staley trombone, Dave Weinstein sampling keyboards and Celeste, and then John Zorn on alto saxophone. And then it's got the voice of John Laurie as Mike Hammer, and then Robert Quine, who is the guitarist that worked with Material. Go and check my Bill Laswell video out, you know, so you know who Robert Quine is, who is the voice of Mike Hammer's Conscious. The texts are by Arto Lindsay. This first composition here is being created using that sort of game theory thing that you get on Cobra, but to a very specific end that Zorn is setting out. The next track on here is called Two Lane Highway, and this is a piece of music that he created for the great blues guitarist Albert Collins. And this is so different from the first track, you know. And we've got some of the classic sort of Zorn musicians on here. So obviously we've got Albert Collins on guitar, but we've got Robert Quine from guitar, who played with Bill Laswell. We've got Wayne Horvitz on piano, Melvin Gibbs on bass, Ronald Shannon Jackson on drums. I've talked about Ronald Shannon Jackson. He's one of the most, his Decoding Society group, which was him and Melvin Gibbs, really was an important 80s jazz fusion act. And then we got Bobby Privett also on drums. But he's also got Big John Patton on organ. And then Albert Collins on guitar. And this is an 18-minute suite, almost like a progressive rock suite that takes Albert Collins through stuff that you know he's comfortable with, but stuff he's not comfortable with. He takes it out of context. And these two compositions couldn't be more different. And then you've got a third composition called Forbidden Fruit, and it's written for voice, string quartet and turntables. The string quartet is the Kronos Quartet. If you don't know the Kronos Quartet, go and check them out, and go and check out their version of Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix. And this is really, this whole track is inspired by the Japanese actor Ishihari Yajiro, who had died just before they made this track. And it's really inspired by this photograph here, which is a still from one of his films. And so what Zorn is trying to do is trying to create the musical equivalent of that, using a string quartet, a voice, and turntables. It's, again, completely unlike. So if you want to hear compositional Zorn, check out Spillane. Fantastic album. Right. If you want to hear him taking on other composers, he's made albums where he's taken on Ornette Coleman, and he's done like thrash metal version of all Ornette Coleman tracks. That's great, you know, and I nearly put that one up. But I think the classic one that got the critics love and has gone down as one of the great jazz albums of all time is The Big Gun Down, where he basically reworks the music of Ennio Morricone. If you're a big fan of spaghetti westerns, you've got to get this. It's absolutely amazing. It doesn't sound like the originals. John Zorn has taken them, but never do you feel that he has disrespected or lost the spirit of Ennio Morricone. That they stand up as equivalent to the original tunes. He's got some great players on here, which I think, if I remember right, the writing on here is so small. I can just about read it. As I get older, my eyesight's going. Bill Frisell's on here, Bobby Previtt's on here, Tim Burney's on here, Otto Lindsay, Wayne Horvitz, Bob James, Anton Fier, another guy that works with Bill as well. It's got harp on here, electric guitars. There's a thing called Milano Odia, which has got Fred Frith from Henry Cowan and from Bill Laswell's band, Jody Harris, Otto Lindsay and Melvin Gibbs on electric guitar, electric bass with drums and harpsichord. You know, like Laswell, he loves these weird mixtures of musicians, but unlike Laswell, he actually is really, well, Laswell does this to a certain extent to be true, but Zorn even goes further out in terms of the arrangements of musicians. Sometimes you get such, you know, odd mixtures of musicians like you know, voice, turntables and string quartet. That is acknowledged as one of the great jazz albums. Even the jazz critics love this album. Even those snotty jazz critics that don't like jazz fusion, they love this album, and it is a great album. Right. In the early 90s, he forms what I would class as one of the great jazz fusion bands called Naked City. And these are my favourite Zorn albums. All the albums are brilliant. I didn't want to just put them all up, so I've just pulled out two that I absolutely love. And the first is the first album, Naked City. This is an absolutely fantastic album. It's got a version of Shot in the Dark, the theme from the Pink Panther film, which I absolutely love. There's an amazing rock version of Lonely Woman by Ornette Coleman. There's various film soundtracks that he's reworked. You've got Ennio Morricone's Sicilian Clan, and then you've also got the classic Naked City sound, which is this thrash metal jump cutting into different genres like funk, jazz. Incredible musicianship. They did it on here first, and it's absolutely amazing. This is a really good introduction to Naked City, and it's a really good introduction to John Zorn, because he does everything on this album. So this is the one that I would say, if you just want to go and buy a John Zorn album, you want to go and get the first one, get this album. And it's one of the great fusion albums. Pretty horrible cover. He's famous for his horrible covers. An even more horrible cover, which I won't show you for too long, is the cover of Grand Guignol. This one here. This is a pretty dark album by John Zorn. I haven't actually discussed this elsewhere, you know, but this is a pretty dark album. This has got the classic lineup, I should say, the lineup Naked City, which is John Zorn, then Bill Frisell on guitar, Wayne Horvitz on keyboards, Fred Frith on bass, Joey Barron on drums, and then Yamatsuka Ai on screaming vocals. And on here they do a number of almost like dark classical pieces, reworks. They do some Debussy, they do some Scriabin, they do some Charles Ives, some Messiaen. It's dark though. They also do a piece called Grand Guignol, which is half an hour long. And I mean, if you're also into, you think, if you're into that goth sound like Sisters of Mercy, or the Swans, it's nothing compared to this. This is as dark gets, right? But then once you get past all that long form, dark, swirling, almost like classical music, there's something like 40 tunes. It's like Napalm Death played by jazz musicians. And they do like 40 tunes that range from sort of 10 seconds long to a minute long, with loads of fast genre. This is like the Naked City album when they go even further into Naked City, and there's a few after this as well that are absolutely incredible. They're all incredible, but I'll just put those two up, Grand Guignol and the first album, Naked City. Right, so those are my 5 albums. I'm just going to go through them again so you can see which ones they are. They're my 5 choices for John Zorn. Would be Cobra, it would be Spillane, it would be The Big Gun Down, and then 2 Naked City albums, which would be Naked City and Grand Guignol. Right. Now, Zorn produced this album in the 90s. And this is the extra I want to show you. Mr. Bungle. Now, this Mr. Bungle are a rock band. They're fronted by Mike Patton. Mike Patton was also the lead singer of Faith No More. Mike Patton has worked extensively with John Zorn. And this is really where you see Zorn's approach bursting into the mainstream. I don't know how many people have listened to The Big Gun Down or Spillane or Cobra, but I've met a lot of people who absolutely love Mr. Bungle. I love Mr. Bungle too. I will at some point go through their albums. That's definitely the first 3 albums, because I think they're absolute classics. If you want a starting place for Mr. Bungle, you never heard them, then grab this. Now, this is a rock band, but it sounds like Naked City. But with Mike Patton singing, it's a little bit more coherent, because it's a rock band. But they are out and out going for that John Zorn approach. The follow-up to this, which is called Disco Volante, is equal, and in some places even further out than Naked City. But this has had an influence on mainstream rock music and almost created a genre in itself. And that's where I really hear the influence of John Zorn. It's in metal. I think this, whereas thrash metal bands before Mr. Bungle sounded like Metallica or Slayer or Anthrax, after Mr. Bungle you see a broadening and a widening. It must be said that Napalm Death, they got this from day one. Mick Harris had his ear to this right from day one. The link between free jazz and thrash metal is a really strong, coherent link, and it's well worth me discussing it if I can, to look at the other artists that have spotted this, bands like Last Exit, like Casper Brooksman's Massacre, all these other artists that have understood that and been able to get to a wider audience by doing that. But I think the king of it and the guy that really did it right and pioneered it and got it right was John Zorn. So there we have my favourite 5 albums by John Zorn. Plus, you must check out the first Mr. Bungle album. And then once you check that album, go and check out all the others. I'm sure with all these fusion fans watching that there's going to be a few that's gone, and he mentioned Mr. Bungle, and are chuffed to bits that I've actually given props to that. I really do want to go down that route. For me, bands like Mr. Bungle and Faith No More, and then Living Colour and Red Hot Chili Peppers, Fishbone, they're all actually coming out of this scene slightly. There was an explosion in music in the late 80s, early 90s that created so many forms of music, grunge, like Public Enemy and rap, and all the styles were suddenly colliding over each other. Well, how much did John Zorn play a part in all that? Anyway, who's to say? But I hope you enjoyed this video on John Zorn. If you like him, then like my video, but put some comments in there, subscribe, tell your friends about it, and get people watching my channel, because you know there's loads of music fans out there and I want them over here watching me and looking at all this stuff I'm doing, because we're talking about some great music here and able to shine a light on stuff that doesn't not necessarily get discussed in the mainstream, and that's very important. That's the reason why I'm here. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you soon with some more videos, and look after yourselves, and that's it. Bye.